They tell you it is a refuge before they let you see the gates, a place of order in a world that has lost its morals, a house where wayward lives can be straightened and futures salvaged. And by the time you realize that none of this is quite true, the door has already closed behind you with a sound that feels far louder than wood against metal has any right to be. You stand in a corridor that smells of soap and damp wool, clutching a small bag that contains everything you've been allowed to keep, and someone who has not bothered to give you her name is already taking even that from your hands, not cruelly, not violently, but with a firm, practiced efficiency that leaves you feeling as if you have made a mistake simply by existing in the wrong way outside. You're safe now, she says as she writes your name in a ledger you are not permitted to read. And the word safe lands in your chest like a stone because nobody who says it quite so calmly ever means what you think they do. You are asked questions in a small office that smells faintly of polish and old paper. Your name, your age, your family, your mistake, although they don't call it that. Not directly. They use softer phrases like trouble, circumstances, influence, as if the thing that brought you here were not a decision but a stain, something that's soaked into you and will not wash out no matter how hard you scrub. There is a form on the desk with rows already printed. Moral welfare, fallen, unfit, need of correction. And you feel your life being slotted into one of those boxes before you even finish the sentence you're speaking. Somewhere beyond the walls, Britain approves. Newspapers speak of institutions like this as necessary protections for the vulnerable. Churches praise their discipline. Politicians talk about public order and safeguarding. Neighbors nod in quiet relief that there is somewhere women like you can be put away where you will not disturb the symmetry of their streets. In the office, the woman with the pen nods as if she agrees with all of them, and when she tells you to remove your jewelry, your coat, your old name, she does so with a softness that makes resistance feel childish. You'll have a number, she says, almost apologetically. It keeps everything in order. She does not say, it keeps you in your place. You discover the shape of that place as you are led through the building. Past doors you are not allowed to open, past windows that let in light but not landscapes, past notice boards covered in rules written in crisp, neat handwriting. The words are familiar: obedience, humility, modesty, diligence, but here they are no longer virtues freely chosen. They are conditions for survival. Other women pass you in the corridor dressed in identical uniforms, their hair tied back in the same functional style, and you notice that they move with a kind of quiet urgency, as if the air itself demands they do everything a little faster than is comfortable. Some glance at you with something like pity. Others look away quickly, the way you might avoid catching the eye of someone in a churchyard, afraid of being dragged into their grief. By the time you reach the dormitory, the transformation has already begun. Your clothes are taken, your hair's inspected, your possessions are reduced to a small bundle stored in a cupboard you will rarely see. On your bed, a tag bears your new identifier, a sequence of letters and numbers that feels like a verdict. Your name is still known, technically, written somewhere in the building, but it is no longer the primary way the system relates to you. You are one of many. A case, a soul to be set right, a problem to be managed. That evening, as you sit in the refectory eating food that tastes of salt and starch and very little else, you hear fragments of how the world outside speaks about places like this. A matron, reading aloud from a newspaper, praises the sacrifice and dedication of those who run such homes. A visiting clergyman thanks God for houses of repentance that save women from themselves. Even a politician, quoted in a small column, calls institutions like this the backbone of our moral peace, a phrase that makes some of the staff smile with quiet pride. No one asks what it feels like to be the bone that is being broken and reset without anesthetic. You learn quickly that the first rule is silence. Silence about the life you had. Silence about the reasons you are here. Silence about the small injustices that accumulate like dust in the corners of every corridor. When you try to speak to the woman in the next bed about your family, a supervising sister appears at your side with uncanny speed. Her hand light on your shoulder, her voice calm as she reminds you that dwelling on the past doesn't help you heal. The word heal is another that does not quite mean what you thought. In this place, healing seems to be measured not by the restoration of who you are, but by how thoroughly you can forget. The second rule is sameness. You rise at the same time to the same bell in the same gray light that seeps through high windows. You recite the same prayers, whether or not you believe in the God to whom they are addressed. You perform the same tasks: laundry, scrubbing, sewing, kitchen duty, tidying the very corridors whose rules are erasing you. Each job is presented as both punishment and privilege, a chance to work off your past and prove you are becoming the kind of woman Britain expects to exist quietly in the background. In the laundry, steam wraps around you like a second skin as you wash clothes that are not yours. Garments that belong to strangers, to institutions, to men whose names you will never hear. The heat makes it hard to think, which is convenient because the institution prefers you not to think too much. Thoughts lead to questions, and questions lead to cracks, and cracks are dangerous in structures built on the illusion of mercy. The third rule is forgetting. At first you resist. You repeat your name in your head as you fall asleep. Rehearse the streets of your old neighborhood in your memory. Recall the exact sound of your mother's voice when she called you in from the rain. But gradually, the institution begins to interfere with even that private act. Each day, supervisors correct your posture, your speech, your reactions. They remind you that certain memories are unhelpful or worldly or self-pitying. When you share a recollection that doesn't fit the narrative of redemption they prefer, you are given extra chores or held back from the rare, tightly controlled letters you're allowed to send. Slowly, it becomes easier not to remember at all. Outside, Britain continues to praise places like this in reports and speeches, comforted by the idea that there is somewhere to send women who do not fit the mold. Respectable people donate money, write admiring articles, raise their children to believe that these institutions are evidence of a compassionate society taking care of its own. They do not see you standing in the half-light of an early morning, scrubbing the same step for the third time because a speck of dirt was interpreted as a sign of inner disorder. They do not hear the way your old name has begun to sound strange in your own mind, like a word from a language you no longer quite speak. They do not know that inside these walls, being saved often means being slowly, meticulously unmade. You begin to understand that the institution does not need to raise its voice to control you. It simply needs to repeat itself enough times that its phrases start living inside your head. At first, you notice the language only in passing. Words like wayward, fallen, difficult, unfit, each one used with a calm certainty that makes disagreement feel like a kind of madness. Then you hear them again in prayers and staff meetings overheard through half-open doors, in carefully rehearsed speeches given to visiting inspectors and donors. Finally, you hear them in your own mouth, as you find yourself explaining to a new arrival that she must accept her place if she wants things to go smoothly. You do not know when you started echoing the institution, only that it happened quietly, in the spaces between exhaustion and obedience. Daily life settles into a rhythm designed to leave no room for reflection. The bell rings before dawn, dragging you from dreams you can no longer fully recall. You dress in the same coarse fabric, stand in the same line, and march in single file to the chapel or hall where the day is consecrated with carefully chosen words about repentance, duty, and gratitude. Gratitude becomes another word that has changed its meaning. In this place, to be grateful is not to feel thankful, but to appear thankful, to accept criticism without flinching, to smile when your work is praised and remain silent when your dignity is not. After prayers, you are assigned to labor. Some days it is laundry, where your hands crack from the constant contact with water and harsh soap. Other days it is the kitchen, where you peel vegetables until your wrists ache. Always one mistake away from a scolding about wastefulness. Occasionally you are sent to clean the very offices where your life was first translated into ink and categories. And as you dust the ledgers and polish the brass, you experience the strange sensation of caring for the paper that tells the world who you are, more loudly than you ever will. The supervision is constant but rarely loud. A raised eyebrow, a slight clearing of the throat, a hand placed just a little too firmly on your arm. These are the instruments of control. Punishments, when they come, are packaged as corrections. Extra chores for inappropriate tone. Lost privileges for lingering on unproductive thoughts. Time spent alone in a bare room, which the staff insists is an opportunity for reflection, but which you experience as a space where the walls feel keenly interested in what you will. Admit to yourself if no one else can hear. The institution tells you that this is for your good, that without such discipline you would drift back into whatever life brought you here. Outside, people repeat that message, reassured by reports that speak of improved behavior and moral reform. They see numbers. How many women pass through? How many successfully reintegrated? How many babies adopted into respectable homes? They do not see the way you flinch at ordinary kindness after months of having every word weighed and measured. They do not see how long it takes for you to answer the question, what do you want? Because for a long time you were not allowed to want anything at all. Among the women inside, stories circulate in quiet, cautious fragments. You learn that some arrived pregnant and left without their children, told it was better that way, that the little ones would have a chance at a life untainted by their mothers' reputations. You hear that some were brought here by fathers, brothers, husbands, ashamed of a scandal or unwilling to tolerate a refusal. Others came through courts or clergy, handed over with signatures and sighs about how society must protect itself. Each story has the same turning point, a decision made about a woman, not with her. In the dormitory, after lights out, whispered conversations become the only place where these truths are spoken. Yet even there, the institution has reached you. You catch yourself judging others by the standards written on the notice boards, silently measuring who seems sufficiently penitent and who might be resistant. When you realize you are doing it, shame hits like cold water, but there is no one you can confess this to who will not use it as proof that the system is working. Parallel to your life, the institution has its own ritual of self-praise. Inspectors visit, clipboards in hand, and staff guide them on carefully curated tours, avoiding the rooms where the air is thick with unspoken grief. You are lined up, uniforms straightened, instructed to answer questions politely but briefly. Did they treat you well? Are you grateful for this second chance? Do you feel you're improving? The expected answers hang in the air before the questions are even finished, and you deliver them dutifully, aware that anything less could result in repercussions later. After they leave, articles appear in local papers describing the visit in glowing terms. Words like admirable, essential, and praiseworthy pepper the paragraphs. And once again, Britain congratulates itself on having built a system that protects its moral fabric. You do not see these articles directly, but snatches of them are read aloud by staff in that same tone of modest pride, and you feel the gap widen between the world's perception and your reality. The institution feeds on that gap. It grows stronger every time someone outside chooses the more comfortable story over the harder truth. On rare occasions, you see a crack in the structure. A younger staff member hesitates when scolding an older woman. A visiting official glances a little too long at the barred windows. A letter from outside hints that not everyone believes the official narrative. These moments are small, fleeting, and yet they are enough to remind you that the institution is not a law of nature, but something built and maintained by people who could, in theory, choose differently. That thought is both comforting and unbearable. It suggests that your suffering is not inevitable but contingent, the result of decisions made by individuals who go home at night and sleep soundly, convinced they are doing the right thing. At times your mind reaches for explanations. You wonder what the matrons tell themselves when they turn out the lights. Do they think of themselves as guardians, as mothers, as shepherds guiding strays back to the fold? Do they rehearse the language of sacrifice and duty until it feels true? Or do they, in their quietest moments, hear the small, unwelcome question, what if we are not saving them but erasing them? The institution has prepared an answer even for that. It teaches staff that doubt is dangerous, that questioning the rules undermines the whole structure, that to be merciful in the wrong way is to be complicit in sin. In this way, they too become shaped by the system, their identities narrowed to fit their roles, until they cannot easily imagine a life outside its walls either. You and they are caught in the same architecture, though in very different rooms. With time, you start to feel yourself splitting into two versions. There is the woman who follows instructions, recites the required words, keeps her head down, and her bed space immaculate. This version becomes skilled at anticipating the next requirement, at performing gratitude, at minimizing friction. Then there is the woman beneath that performance, the one who remembers laughing freely once, who knows that mistakes and desires do not make a person disposable, who still wonders what might have happened if anyone had chosen to stand beside her rather than send her here. The institution's goal is to make the first version swallow the second entirely. It wants you to believe that you are nothing more than the role it has assigned. On some days, you fear it is succeeding. On others, the internal resistance is so strong that it makes your chest ache. Somewhere beyond these walls, the country that praised this place carries on. Trains running, shop doors opening, church bells ringing, newspapers being folded and thrown onto doormats. People speak of discipline, responsibility, traditional values, and when the institution is mentioned, if it is mentioned at all, it is as a symbol of those things. They do not see the cost at which that symbol is maintained. They do not see that behind every tidy phrase about order and virtue there is a ledger in which your name has been quietly downgraded from person to problem, from problem to patient, from patient to number. They do not know that inside you are being encouraged day after day to forget how to answer the simplest question, who are you when no one is watching? You begin to notice that time behaves strangely inside the institution, stretching and folding in ways that make the outside world feel like a story someone once told you rather than a place you actually lived. Days blur together, marked only by the bell, by the tasks assigned, by the subtle shifts in the moods of those who control your movements. You stop measuring time by dates and start measuring it by permissions granted or taken away, a letter you are allowed to send, a brief moment of outdoor air in a walled courtyard, an unexpected reprimand that sets you back weeks in whatever invisible hierarchy governs your existence here. In this distorted timeline, you start to observe the women around you more closely. not out of curiosity, but out of a searching instinct, a need to understand whether their fates foretell your own. One of them, an older woman with graying hair and a slight tremor in her hands, seems to operate almost mechanically. She never speaks unless addressed, never sits unless instructed, never expresses an emotion beyond polite compliance. You hear whispers that she has been here for years, long after the reason for her admission lost relevance. She once had a daughter, someone murmurs, whom she was told she was unfit to raise. The daughter would be an adult now, perhaps with children of her own, never knowing that her mother folds sheets in a silent dormitory every day as if rehearsing the motions of a life she no longer claims. Another woman, much younger, carries an air of quiet defiance that has been worn down to something brittle and dangerous. You see the staff watch her more closely, as though waiting for a misstep they can record as evidence of incorrigibility. She was brought here for being too bold, according to the rumors, too loud, too independent, too unwilling to accept the confines of a life chosen for her. The institution speaks of saving her, but its methods seem aimed at erasing precisely the parts of her that made her who she was. When she questions a rule during morning assembly, she disappears for 2 days, and when she returns, her posture has changed. She keeps her eyes down now, and no one needs to tell you that something in her has broken. You wonder as you watch her scrub a floor with robotic precision whether breaking was the point. These women are not exceptions, they are examples. Each one represents a version of how the institution reshapes those who enter it. And as you observe them, you feel an uncomfortable truth settling in your chest. The system does not rely solely on punishment. It relies on exhaustion, on routine, on the gradual wearing away of resistance until compliance feels like the only option that will let you breathe without fear. Sometimes, in the small pockets of time when supervision loosens, fragments of who you once were resurface. You recall the texture of the coat you wore on the day you arrived, the warmth of sunlight on your face outside the gate, the exact inflection of your mother's voice when she used your name. These memories feel like contraband smuggled past a border guard who would confiscate them if she could. You cling to them quietly, aware that forgetting them entirely would make it easier to survive, but harder to ever leave this place whole. One evening, during a rare moment when conversation is tolerated, the women share their admission stories in hushed tones. Each one reflects a reality Britain prefers not to acknowledge. Assistant that welcomes the convenience of disappearing inconvenient. Women. A girl sent here because her employer suspected her of impropriety. A wife whose husband declared her hysterical after she refused to tolerate his infidelity. A young woman misdiagnosed with moral weakness by a man who mistook trauma for rebellion. Listening to their stories, you feel a quiet, cold recognition forming. This institution thrives not on the moral failings of those inside, but on the fears and desires of those outside, fears of shame, of scandal, of disorder, of women who refuse to fit the shapes prescribed for them. Outside, people describe places like this as compassionate havens, but inside, compassion is rationed carefully, used sparingly, and offered only when it reinforces obedience. The staff speak of duty often, but you notice how rarely they speak of humanity. They refer to the women as cases, as burdens, as souls in need of correction. When they write reports, they focus on compliance metrics, punctuality, cleanliness, penance. No report ever mentions what you dream about at night or what memories keep you awake in the dark. Those parts of you do not exist on paper, and so, slowly, they begin to feel unreal. In this environment, even kindness becomes a double-edged sword. A supervisor who speaks softly can disarm you, making you more likely to accept instructions without question. A matron who praises your progress can make you crave approval you once would have dismissed. Small gestures of warmth feel like sunlight in a prison yard, comforting, but ultimately incapable of changing the nature of the place. You learn to be cautious of the staff who are nice because niceness is the most effective tool the institution has for making you participate in your own erasure willingly. There are moments when the facade cracks, though never for long. A staff member snaps at a colleague, frustration slipping through the veneer of calm. A matron lingers too long over the Bible passage about mercy, her eyes giving away something like fatigue. A supervisor turns away sharply when a woman asks whether she will ever be allowed to leave. These glimpses reveal that even those who enforce the system are caught in its machinery. Their identities narrowed to fit their roles, their choices constrained by fear of appearing lenient. The institution shapes them too, convincing them that discipline equals virtue and doubt equals failure. The question of leaving becomes a quiet obsession among the women. Some ask about it openly and are told that release is determined by progress, by repentance, by the institution's sense of readiness. Others ask nothing at all, convinced that hope is a dangerous indulgence. You, uncertain where you fall between them, begin to observe the patterns. Women are released when it suits the narrative of the institution, when they can be showcased as proof of successful reform. When a bed is needed, when a birth complicates the paperwork, but even those who leave often do not truly escape. The world outside still believes the narrative of their failure, their fall, their need for correction. They return to a society that has already been taught to distrust them. That thought grows inside you like a quiet, creeping shadow. What if leaving does not restore you but merely relocates your captivity? You begin to understand why some women stop thinking of the outside world altogether. For them, the institution has become not just a prison but a frame of reference, the only environment that makes sense anymore. When identity has been stripped away so thoroughly, rebuilding it feels impossible. Why try to reclaim a self that the world has already declared broken? Late one night, lying awake as the dormitory breathes around you in a rhythm of restless sleep, you realize the most terrifying part of this place is not the punishments or the rules or the endless labor. It is the silence. The silence in the corridors, the silence in the reports, the silence of a society that prefers not to ask what happens behind doors that bear the label respectable. Silence is the institution's greatest achievement. It protects it more effectively than locks or walls. It allows Britain to praise what is happening inside while refusing to look closely. And in that silence, you feel yourself dissolving, not violently, not suddenly, but slowly, like ink fading on a page left too long in the sun. You hold on as tightly as you can to the memory of your own name, repeating it silently each night like a fragile act of rebellion. But some evenings the name comes a fraction of a second slower than it used to, as though it is traveling through fog to reach you. You tell yourself that you will remember, that you must remember, because forgetting would mean the institution has finished its work. And yet, as the bell rings again at dawn, calling you into another day of orderly unmaking, you feel how thin the line has become between who you were and who you are being turned into. Years later, long after you have left the institution, long after its doors have closed for the last time and its buildings have been repurposed into flats or offices or left to sag quietly behind boarded windows, you will realize that the most enduring thing it took from you was not your youth, your choices, or your child, but the simple, steady certainty of your own name. Even when you say it aloud now in a different town, surrounded by people who know you only as the person you have painstakingly become, there is a faint echo of hesitation, a pause in which another identity, a number, a case file, a whispered label tries to step in front of it. Leaving was not a single day, but a series of disorienting moments. The call to the office, the announcement that you were ready or suitable, or simply that there was no longer any reason to keep you. The signing of documents that described your departure in administrative terms, as if you were a piece of furniture being transferred rather than a human being stumbling back into a world that had kept turning without you. Outside, the air felt too large, the sky too bright, the streets too unpredictable. People walked past you with the casual confidence of those whose identities had never been subjected to a ledger's approval. You realized with a lurch that freedom does not automatically restore the parts of you that were carefully dismantled. The institution, officially, began to fade. Reports were filed, boxes were stored, some quietly destroyed. There were whispers of inquiries, of journalists asking questions, of former residents writing letters that did not receive replies. For a long time, Britain treated these concerns as unfortunate but isolated. The growing discomfort about such places smoothed over with phrases like "of their time" and "well-intentioned." When stories did surface, about babies taken, about women confined on the flimsiest of pretexts, about lives bent around the will of priests, matrons, or medical authorities, the focus often drifted quickly to statistics, to legal responsibilities, to chains of command. The language remained abstract because abstraction is safer. It allows a country to discuss harm without having to imagine in detail what it feels like to scrub a floor for the 20th time that week while your own name slips slowly from your grasp. You try to speak about it sometimes, carefully measuring how much the listener can absorb before they flinch. Some are sympathetic in a distant way, as if you were describing a tragedy in a far-off country. They say how awful, how shocking, how unimaginable, and then, gently, they steer the conversation back to topics that sit more comfortably at kitchen tables. Others are less kind. They ask what you did to deserve being sent there, whether you learned your lesson, whether in the end it was perhaps for the best. Their questions echoed the logic that built the institution in the first place, the assumption that if such a place existed and was praised, it must have had good reason to catch you in its net. You realize that the system did not just erase you while you were inside. It also wrote the script for how people would respond to you once you left. Years pass. Some of the women you knew inside die quietly, their lives reduced in public records to dates and addresses that say nothing about the long shadow cast by those walls. Others, braver or perhaps more tired of silence, speak up when formal investigations finally begin to ask in official terms how things could have gone so wrong under the banner of respectability. They sit in rooms with microphones and bottled water, facing panels of officials who apologize on behalf of institutions that no longer exist in name, but whose logic can still be traced in certain policies, certain attitudes, certain offhand remarks about the kind of women who get themselves into trouble. The apologies, when they come, are meticulously worded. They acknowledge shortcomings, express sorrow, promise lessons have been learned. For some, those words offer a thin thread of validation. For others, they feel like an attempt to seal the story with a neat ending that it does not and cannot possess. Because the reality is that the institution's true legacy is not contained in reports or archives or even in the buildings that remain. It lives in quieter places, in the way your heart races at the sound of a bell, in the way you still hesitate before expressing an opinion that might be labeled defiant, in the way you find yourself apologizing for taking up space, for asking questions, for existing in a world that once insisted you should be grateful simply to be allowed to continue. You learn slowly to rebuild. You practice saying your own name until it feels less like a borrowed coat and more like a garment cut to fit your shoulders. You tell your story to those who will truly listen, not because you want to live in the past, but because pretending it never happened would be another kind of erasure. You discover that there is a strange strength in being able to describe calmly and clearly the mechanisms by which your identity was stripped away. And in doing so, you begin to see the institution not as a mysterious monolith, but as a construction, elaborate, flawed, and crucially reproducible. That realization is the darkest and most important lesson you carry. Nothing about that place was inevitable. It was built from choices. It was maintained by cooperation, by cowardice, by conviction, and by convenience. It was protected by silence and praise. And if such a structure could be assembled once, it can be assembled again under different names, adorned with different justifications, applauded by different generations who tell themselves that control is care and obedience is healing. When you walk past a modern building where decisions are made about other people's lives, an office, a clinic, a courtroom, a social services center, you feel a prickle at the back of your neck. You listen carefully to the language used about those who are being managed, assessed, protected. You hear, sometimes faint echoes of the phrases that shaped your captivity: unsuitable, unstable, immoral, non-compliant. You understand, with a clarity that many do not, how easily procedures intended to help can be weaponized when no one stops to ask what it feels like to be on the receiving end of them. Perhaps that is, in the end, the most important thing you have to offer, not just your story, but the warning contained within it. The institution Britain praised until women lost their identities inside did not begin as a place of obvious cruelty. It began as an idea that certain lives needed to be corrected for the sake of the greater good, that certain women were safer behind walls, that respectability required sacrifice, and that it was acceptable for that sacrifice to be demanded, not offered. It grew because people found it reassuring. It endured because those who suffered within it were not believed, or were too ashamed to speak, or were taught to think their suffering was deserved. It ended only when a combination of changing morality, outside scrutiny, and exhausted courage finally forced the doors open. The cost of that ending was measured not just in public scandal, but in private fractures that will never fully heal. Somewhere in a box that escaped destruction, your old file may still exist. It will contain your name, misspelled perhaps, your age, a short summary of the reasons given for your admission, a few lines about your conduct, a note about your release. It will not mention the nights you whispered your identity into the dark to keep it from dissolving. It will not describe the moment you first realized that the country you loved had found it easier to lock you away than to listen to you. It will certainly not record the quiet, stubborn decision you made years later, to tell this story so that others might recognize the warning signs when respectability once again demands that certain people be hidden for their own good. That part of the record lives only in you, and in those who hear you and choose, this time, not to look away.